Let's see. I don't know if there's a way to make that less loud. Is it okay? Okay. All right, good. I'm going to start like all good Catholics with a confession. As you heard, I am a product of Dominican and Holy Cross education, and I turned down 2 Jesuit colleges. So I don't know if you still want to have me. It's not that Loyola and Georgetown aren't fantastic universities. They just can't figure out how to get a football team that can compete, and that was a deal breaker. So, when Tom asked me, we attend St. Rita's together uptown. When he asked me to do this months ago, I thought, oh God, I didn't train in the Ignatian spiritual tradition. I don't know anything about this. So, of course, I called my mom because she is the greatest theologian that none of you have ever heard of. And she immediately started translating some papal encyclicals and Ignatius's work from the Latin. And I said, I think this is that crowd, Mom. And then I called my Uncle Danny, who's uncle in New Orleans sense only, and that he's known my parents for 50 years. But he is a Jesuit and double Loyola graduate, which means he considers himself an expert on Ignatian spirituality. And he was happy to sort of fill me in. And I'm glad he did, because in addition to telling me some really funny Franciscan, Dominican, Jesuits walk into a bar jokes, he said, the thing you have to remember about Jesuit spirituality is that it's a practical spirituality. And I said, really? Because it's not quite their brand. Looking at this gorgeous church and how much Georgetown would have cost to attend, this is really not quite what they're known for. But he said, no, look into it, read up on it. Because if anybody knows me, I'm pretty practical. I'm the child of an engineer, and we think in one direction, and that's linear. And so reading into what the tenets of Ignatian spirituality, the one, and this is no surprise, given what Tom just said about my family, the one that really stands out to me is walking with the excluded. I'm married to a wonderful devout Catholic. He is a mystic. He deeply believes, he's deeply spiritual. I am the practical one. He is the Mary, I am the Martha, right? And so when we have arguments about faith, it's like, get out of your head and stop reading. What can we do, right? So to me, walking with the excluded is faith. It's the way that I was brought up, and it's the way that I express my faith. And so, I appreciate the opportunity just to tell you a little bit about that. But as I was thinking about it more, there's a lot of ways you can walk with someone. When you are in love or with your beloved, you walk hand in hand, no space between the bodies, right? As anyone who's been the parent of a teenager can tell you, you can walk with someone with their back to you far ahead, right? And so I think for me, my journey has been how to walk like you are walking with your beloved, with the excluded. Because, the way I think about it is that the distance between the person you're walking with is inversely proportional to the distance between you and God, right? The closer you are when you walk with the excluded, and I don't know if I like that term, but I'm not going to argue with Ignatius for sure. That's how close you need to be to have that relationship with God. And sort of through my life, there have been periods where I've walked, but I haven't been real close. And I think I see my journey as how can I get as close as possible to those with whom it is a privilege to walk and with whom I choose to walk. Who are the excluded and where do they find a home? Well, they found a home in my home, right? As Tom mentioned, some of you might know my parents. I'm the oldest, the only biological child. They adopted 7 more. And this is adoptions before adoptions were cool and sexy and Brad and Angelina were doing them. This is the 1970s and 80s in suburban New Orleans, Louisiana. And so when you talk about who is excluded, right, it was everyone who didn't fit the mold of what adopting a kid should look like, which is, if you are white, a white, healthy baby with nothing wrong with it, right? Well, there's not a whole lot of those to go around if you're really going to commit to this. So my parents in the 70s and early 80s adopted 2 children from Asia, one with cerebral palsy, so an obvious physical disability, two biracial children. One parent was black, one was white, which at the time were children that nobody wanted. Now, thank goodness, there's a lot more of them out there, which is great, but no one wanted these children. And then two other children with severe mental and physical handicaps, so in a wheelchair with a trach, fed through a feeding tube, right? So I grew up not just walking with, but getting like jumped on and sharing a bathroom with what one might consider the excluded, because my parents really lived Matthew 25, right? That's always been my favorite. That what you do for the least. And again, it troubles me sometimes growing up in this family to say they are the least, right? They are the excluded. And it's only because we are considering them the least and we are excluding them. My brother Matthew, for example, was wheelchair bound, profoundly mental handicap, right? His IQ was like 25 or 30 if you could even measure it. But he taught, his gifts were unabashed joy, unabashed love, and the ability to make us all stop and think about what we were doing and how it might affect him. My mother taught at Dominican high school, taught social justice for many years, and would bring him in, not sort of as a show and tell, but really as a teacher, right? So anybody would look at him and think, oh, he's on the margins of society. How could he have a quality of life? But he did, and his spirit lives. He died in the mid-90s after living a pretty long life for a kid like him. But that profoundly sort of helped me get on the path of sort of who was excluded and why were we excluding them and why shouldn't we? The other sort of seminal moments for me in my early life were, my mom taught social justice at Dominican at a time when no one had heard of social justice. Now everybody talks about it, right? Now it's cool. And she started teaching some of the works that were coming out of Central America and Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology, right? And this seeing the Gospels through working alongside the poor and fighting oppression. And this is a long Jesuit tradition, right? I mean, the Jesuits were some of the ones that started this. And I was reading an article about it later that a Jesuit missionary published. He said, once I found this way of thinking about Catholicism, I could not be Catholic without it. And that really resonated with me, because for me, that is what faith is. It is not just reciting the prayers, it is living and sort of radically transforming the way we work in communities with those to help them grow closer to God. And so we sort of shorten that distance on the walk. Interestingly, Notre Dame in the 1990s was not a hotbed of liberation theology, as you can imagine, but they did have one class, and boy, I took it, and I was excited about that. So I guess didn't feel natural to me, but it makes sense now that I found my way to the emergency department. Did not know I wanted to go to medical school, came home. Sociology is about as close to public health as you can get without the epidemiology part of it. So very, very similar ways of looking at the world, looking at societies, working for change. But I just had a moment that, I could write papers all day, I could be a professor, and that's wonderful and meaningful, but I'm not going to be walking with anyone, right? I will never know. I want to see and be and understand and be taught by the people that I might want to help, right? And so that's what the emergency department is. It is the only place, really in healthcare for sure, but in a lot of other places where there are no barriers, where everyone is maybe not welcome, but can walk through the door and no one questions why they're there, right? So you could be old, you could be young, you could have insurance, you could not, you could be homeless, you could be shot, you could be having a heart attack, you could just be cold because you're sleeping outside. You could speak the language, you could not speak the language, right? And to me, that's where I wanted to be. I didn't want to have anyone place a barrier between helping them. when you work in the ER, you really have to see God in the small moments. I had the privilege of training at Charity. I was the last class to do my residency there. And I don't want to romanticize Charity, that it was this like wonderful place and everyone was so happy and we delivered the best care, right? The wonderful thing about Charity is that you could never escape honesty and reality, and sometimes that reality was pretty brutal. Even when I worked there in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was an east and a west wing, and so you would work in East 900 or West 900 or wherever. But the E, if you looked really closely, you could see that it used to be a C, and that C stand for colored. There was a colored section and a white section, right? And so being in that building every day, you had to face the brutal truths, just being in the building. And the same thing with the patients. And the amazing thing about training at Charity is not all the cool stuff you get to do, which you do, but that's not really what, I think that's how a lot of people sell it. It's that your patients are constantly teaching you how to be a better person and a better physician, and you're not paying them, right? You're the one getting paid for the privilege if you're a physician there. Some of the moments that stand out, I was pregnant with my first child when I was a resident, and I had a terrible, weird hip thing, and so I sort of dragged myself around the ER. If anybody ever went to the Charity ER, it was really big and really long, and I was taking care of this woman who probably had days to live. She was stage 4 cancer and just, looked terrible, looked like someone who had days to live. And if she was at Charity Hospital, that meant that she probably did not get the care that she should have gotten, and her life was probably going to prematurely end. And I don't know what she was there for, but as I was talking to her, she said, "Oh, baby, you look so tired. Would you like to sit down while we're talking? You really should take a rest." And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. That this woman who everybody's written off, right? She's probably not going to live very long, is more concerned for my well-being than I communicated to her that I was for her. And it's that sort of experience that happens to us over and over and over again. Having to tell a grieving family that the person that they kissed goodbye in the morning is not coming home. And having the family through this horrendous, the worst moment of their life, turn around and say, thank you for taking care of us. If you really stop to think about that, it's a tremendous gift and also a responsibility, right? I have to be next to that person, right? I need that person to remind me of humanity and of God through us, just as much as they needed me to try to do whatever I could to save their loved one. That's why, we work there. Not because we are, giving, there's lots of doctors and they're all pretty good, right? We try hard, but what we gain in terms of our humanity and spirituality, I think, is more than what we give. And so then I got to the health department, and I thought, well, how hard can this be, right? I've survived Katrina, I worked at Charity, I'm an ER doctor, whatever, I can handle, mass casualties, I'm cool. And then God gave us a global pandemic. So here we are again. Very early, of course, we had to make a lot of decisions that were not popular, and that were pretty severe. And that's a hard thing to do if you aren't always trying to focus on those who don't have a voice, right? And I'm incredibly grateful that I had the 15 years of training in the emergency department with people who don't have a voice, who can't advocate, who can't call me up on the phone and berate me because I've inconvenienced them in some way. It became very clear in COVID, in those first horrible weeks, that the people who were dying were the excluded, or who we might consider the excluded, in large part. not everyone. I mean, it was really an equal opportunity pandemic there in the beginning. But the folks who couldn't work from home, and the folks who went home, multi-generational households because they couldn't isolate themselves, and the folks who were essential, who had to keep working at the grocery stores and the pharmacies and the buses, right? You know, and who may not have access to the same medical care that we enjoy because they're on Medicaid or they're uninsured. Those were the ones that it was really quickly apparent that we were going to lose a lot of if we didn't do things differently. You know, I did a lot of reading in the first early days of the pandemic. I read everything I could get my hands on pandemics in New Orleans in particular. You know, that's yellow fever, right? And it's pretty horrifying when you read some of what happened in yellow fever in New Orleans. It's very, very similar. Folks blamed the epidemic on poor people, unsanitary people. It's happening to them, it's not happening to us. You don't have to shut anything down, it's fine. You're gonna hurt us economically. And what happened is that was completely untrue, and it caused yellow fever to explode and spread all up and down the river in the US because of that. So a lot of the things that we did were trying to make sure that those who would be excluded, who some in our community consider expendable, were not viewed that way. And that's why everything that we've done since then, we were the first city in the country to set up community testing sites, which the federal government thought we were crazy for doing. We had, they couldn't understand why we weren't just so happy they would come in and give us some soldiers and tell people to come drive through and get tested. And we, convinced them very grudgingly that no, we want to actually put testing sites in neighborhoods for people who don't have cars, people who might not speak English, people who might not really want to see a guy with a gun when they're scared and frightened and they want to test. And so we had the first one at Xavier, also not a Jesuit, but still pretty good, right? And I remember thinking, no one's going to show up. No one is, what have I done? I bought all the food for the party and no one's going to show up to the party and I'm crazy and the feds were right. And I drove up about a half hour early and there was a line around the block, and I went up to one woman who was 89 and she said, I live, a half mile away. I walked to get here. I wouldn't have any other way to get tested. And at that point, I felt very close to her, right? And I felt very close to the work that we're doing. And that's what I think, we want to continue to keep the focus on, right? I'm hopeful that COVID is in its endemic phase. Wishing doesn't always make it so, but I feel we've done a lot. But there are folks who are still excluded from the freedoms that we're enjoying right now. It's the immunocompromised who probably aren't going to be able to go out of their house, if at all, without masks for years. It's the bedbound. It's the elderly folks who, really are concerned. Do I want to go out to dinner? Do I want to see my grandchildren? It's the little ones that are not quite there yet. And so while I get a lot of emails from folks who are not in those groups, I think those, the perspective of that those folks are doing fine. We're always going to have what Ignatius called the excluded, and so they have to be the top of mind. If we can walk with them, walk beside them reliably, regularly, then everybody else is going to be fine, right? Then we're all going to be walking in one big group together. It's not always easy. I can't tell you I haven't been that surly teenager, like, yeah, I see you, but I don't really want to walk with you right now, right? The emergency department has many challenging patients, and I will be the first to tell you it is hard to find God in all of them. When they are throwing things at you and yelling things at you, it is really, really hard. Or when you see someone, what has been done to someone by someone else, It's really hard to find the God in that. But you can't stop walking, right? That's what I think. You got to keep walking, and you got to be practical. And that's me. So that's it.
While you're thinking about your comment or question, there's a sign-up sheet in the back if you'd like to learn about upcoming speakers in the series, but also if you'd like to join Jen's mother and me in studying in the Loyola Institute for Ministry, find out more about that opportunity. So Jen, thank you so much, and you can, I'll let you feel
sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I started with cholera, then I did yellow fever, then I did the Great Influenza, John Barry's great work, and then I read The Plague by Albert Camus, and I don't know what organism that is, but that was a scary one too. It really is eye-opening. The book on yellow fever I read, I think was someone's dissertation, right? So it's kind of wonky, but it sort of showed me that there's not much new under the sun, right? There's always a lot of fear when something is unknown. They didn't know until the late 1890s how yellow fever was transmitted, and the big New Orleans epidemic was like 1870s. I mean, they had several, but this was the big one. So there's a lot of fear. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation, even without social media, right? You would have newspapers that would publish things that were questionable. The science had to catch up to figure out, and it's hard when the science isn't there to know what the right thing to do is. And there was a lot of blaming the poor, right? Blaming the poor, blaming immigrants, which I think, very similar to a lot of what we've seen today. We blame China today, right? We blamed so-and-so. It's not, I famously got into trouble, some folks were acting as if it was a disease not of the upper classes, right? Those people are getting sick, right? In the end, science wins, or it did. I hope that it still does. I will say what's really fascinating about yellow fever is that if you read the city charter for New Orleans, and I did before I took this job because I was like, what am I getting into? It's clearly written after that epidemic to give public health authority to protect the public against another one. That's where so much of the authority comes from, but the way it's written, I don't think it's been revised since the 1880s or 90s. It's because it mentions all kinds of diseases that I had to look up because they don't exist anymore. So what gave me hope is that the lessons that were learned from yellow fever were, I'm sure, really hard fought, and a lot of people died. But they were able to turn that into sort of sound policy that protected us 125 years later. I hope that we can preserve that because, this is not going to be the last pandemic. And I hope that we don't forget the lessons that we learn and undo them, because I think that'll really be a problem later on. Yes, ma'am.
So you had to make choices constantly during all of this between bad and terrible options.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself making decisions?
That's the good thing about being an ER doctor, is that we make decisions all the time with limited information in very tense situations where it's potentially life and death. So I really do feel like God made me be an ER doctor so that I would be comfortable with that. We're used to saying this is the best available evidence, and this is what I think is going to be the path that is the least harmful, right? Sometimes it's the least harmful. It's not always the best, it's the least harmful. So that was really, really helpful. That training was natural. And, our state health officer, Dr. Cantor, who's a close friend, is also an ER doctor, which explains why I think he was really comfortable with that. I think that some of the problems you see with the CDC is they don't think like that. They take a really long time and look at everything, and that's just not the real world. But the other thing is I really am a nerd for spreadsheets. And since March 9th, 2020, last year, 2 years tomorrow, I have kept my own spreadsheet with every piece of data on New Orleans that we needed, because I didn't want to have to trust, oh, look, the LDH spreadsheet is down, or wait, where did CDC get that number, right? And I think when all else fails, you go to the numbers because they don't lie. Oh, yeah.
There's a disease which has a big Latin name that says some bacterial in the brain. It's like tuberculosis. Is there any connection between what I'm trying to describe, which I read in Michael's book, and your dad says, oh, that's hooey? This is my daughter. So, daughter, is there any connection with diseases that enter the brain, or does it enter from the blood cells to the brain?
You mean COVID, or you mean this particular bacteria? I mean, there's a lot of scary bacteria out there. Generally, the way bacteria are less likely to cause global outbreaks because, number one, we have antibiotics to treat them. Number two, the way they spread is generally not, I'm making big generalizations, as contagious as viruses. But there are all sorts of really horrifying bacteria out there. Some in your brain, some in not. I wonder if you're talking about Naegleria. Is it the one in the water, or that's an amoeba? Meningitis, maybe?
Some of the people going to the hospital when you incubate, is that the right word?
Intubated,
And that the tubes aren't cleaned too well?
Oh, yes. Yeah, those. Yeah, those are pretty rare, thank goodness, just because hospitals have such strict, protocols for cleaning. That does happen from time to time, but it's generally not something that's going to spread, really quickly to other people. Yeah, so not yet anyway. Somebody else? Yeah.
What resources did you draw on when you were criticized for the decisions you made? Spiritual resources, other resources. How did you get through it?
You do have to have a pretty thick skin to be an ER doctor, because you get yelled at all the time by surgeons, cardiologists, patients, all of the above. Never psychiatrists, though. They're always lovely. Dr. Rigmer. I did pray, for wisdom, and I did, and I don't know that it came across, but I really did struggle. I really, really, really did try to see all sides. So even if you're coming at me and not being kind about it, it's important for me to understand where you're coming from, right? I don't want to shut down anyone's business. I understood the real cost of what we were doing. There's the human cost, which, I believe that the human life is, trumps everything else, but that doesn't mean that the economic is not substantial and real. I agonized over it, and so I tried to find formulas and algorithms saying, okay, if we shut down for this many weeks, how much business is lost, how much, those don't exist, right? So I prayed a lot for wisdom. There's just if I'm doing the wrong thing, if I'm not, please just give me the grace to let me have as much information as I can to make that. I also started walking in the mornings, which was nice. It was weird because sometimes people honk at me, and I don't know if they're like honking at me and they're going to run me over, or they're honking at me and I know. So because I walk on the Napoleon path, lots of people drive there. And I can't say, I think for all of us, some of my coping was probably not the best. I was probably not as nice to my children as I could have been. I was probably not as nice to my husband as I could have been, and not realizing that they were all struggling with, being out of school and not seeing their friends, and my daughters, some of their birthdays, they weren't able to see anybody on their birthday, right? I was really tunnel vision, and so I had to do a lot of self-reflection to say, oh, that was not a really healthy coping mechanism. I think we've all, maybe not all, but most of us have kind of experienced that. But the prayer helped, and I'm not really good at praying. I'm not super sophisticated. It's soothing to me. I can't tell you that I have special prayers that I like or don't like, but just to be able to have it. I usually, like, if I say a decade of the rosary, that's kind of like my meditation. Right? It's helpful. Oh, yes.
Thank you for your talk and
Sure.
the work that you did on our behalf. As you look at the arc of the next few years here in New Orleans, what is your sense of what's top priority in continuing to rebuild the community?
That is an excellent question, because we just published a community health improvement plan for the next 3 years. I invite you to read it. Yeah, we knew before COVID we had serious foundational health issues in this city. This is not a surprise. I had a little bit of schadenfreude when the rest of the country realized there was health inequities everywhere, right? Because a lot of them were like, oh, well, that happens in the South, or that happens in those poor cities, right? What? New York City had health inequities too? Who knew? So, again, forgive me. But, undoing generations of inequities in health doesn't, you can't just do it in the next few years. But it really, when you look at what shapes health, it's the same thing that keep us from having a thriving economy is the reason why we're unhealthy, right? It's income inequality, poverty, lack of access to high quality schools for everyone, lack of access. So much of our community is excluded, whether that is there's not a bus that goes in your neighborhood, or the bus doesn't come on time, or you weren't able to get through high school and it wasn't a great high school anyway, so your jobs are limited, and so your earning potential is limited. And we're talking, generational gains that need to happen. So for us to improve health, we've got to work hand in hand with not only our healthcare partners, right, but our nonprofits and our business sector to fix those issues, because it's the only way we're going to be out of 49th place in everything for health. So it's not easy, but I do think that COVID gave us the opportunity to let people know that more. I think people get it a little bit more. So a lot of that, is really back to the basics. It's, poverty reduction, income inequality reduction, investing in maternal child health. The best money you can spend is in the life of a mother and infant, or even pre-pregnancy, right? That investment, and it's not a big investment, reaps dividends throughout the life cycle of the entire family. And so it's just sort of, and I think the city, we're trying all to do that, right, with a focus on early childhood funding, but we even need to go farther upstream. So that's that. Mental health, of course, that's on everybody's mind. That wasn't great before. It's not great now. So some really foundational things.
Thanks very much for this. It's wonderful. I would just note that this church was originally built during the yellow fever epidemic of the early 1850s. So it was raging when the church was originally being conceived of and built. But I was curious, sort of addressed a kind of macro question. I wanted to ask maybe a kind of more micro spiritual question, in the sense of, this probably doesn't happen because you're in a professional environment, in the ER or in the public health department, and you're not, I assume you're not likely, to have colleagues and things asking you about faith and religion and spirituality a lot. Maybe so, great, so. But I wonder if you could imagine a young colleague who comes to you and can definitely resonate with everything you were saying in terms of being practical, helping people, walking with people, listening to people, and who then says, and that's that's what's important to me, and I don't need God. You know, I don't need, I want to help people because I want to help people, not because I have to help people, because God says so. So what might you say to someone who I guess kind of wants to separate out the wonderful things that you do on behalf of so many, and separate that from any kind of spiritual or religious motivation?
Well, first of all, the great thing about being a health director and an ER doctor in New Orleans is that everybody's Catholic or pseudo-Catholic, right? Because they do the rituals, they give up the meat and all that. You know, I did my press conference last week with my ashes on my head, where I said, we're taking the mask off, and here's my ashes. You know, it's really lovely to be able to be open about my faith at work. In fact, I'm taking our public health emergencies team to the St. Joseph's altar next week because I said, we need hurricane bread. We clearly didn't have the right kind last year. We're all going. I don't care, you know, what religion you are. And they're like, great, teach us more about this, you know. So it is really a joy to not have to explain. But the question you're asking me is very personal, because I have a 16-year-old preparing for confirmation who does not want to be confirmed. And that has been the crux of our discussions. She's a good person. She's a good kid. She's mad at the Catholic Church for a variety of reasons. Doesn't think she needs it, right? And she has challenged me to come up with really good answers to that question. I don't know that I have really good questions, you know, but the way I say is that all these things are good, but without a foundation for why, without like thinking about what is the bigger picture, you know, why do you do this? Why do you want to do this? Where does that come from? That doesn't come from inside yourself. It comes from outside, and that's God. It's just not as meaningful to do those things without really understanding and deeply feeling why you're doing them in a spiritual kind of way. She doesn't get it yet. And I tell her, you know, you might not get this now. I don't know if I got it when I was 16. Who knows? I don't even remember. But you might need to come back to this one day, right? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when you're facing a crisis, or when you have your own children, or when you know, something is really a need. If you don't have this foundation, all those good works that you want to do, that's not going to help you. So I don't know if that's the right answer. I think that's, you know, that's the challenge of the church these days. It's like, I'm not spiritual, I just do good things. Well, I don't know how you can do one without the other, quite frankly.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you, guys.